So, continuing on from what you were saying, like, last time about, like, how music and, like, the AIDS crisis and everything.
Right.
Yeah.
So the biggest deal, I guess, in the early 90s, and don't forget, I was at drama school.
Yeah.
And where Lambda was in Earl's Court, and that was a big kind of hub for a gay Australian community, and Freddie Mercury lived on Logan Place. So they all dressed like Freddie, with moustaches and leather jackets and stuff. But at the time, I guess we had... The music of the time was soul to soul, and the ethos of the time was very much like... there wasn't... I think it was a more successful time in terms of cultural fluidity, in that there was a kind of colour blindness in a way, I think.
Okay.
That was certainly my experience of the time. And so any kind of race riots or any kind of stuff like that was just extremists. It wasn't like... it wasn't the general norm of society. I think the fact that we had Universal Love at number one in like 92 was very much indicative of the kind of culture of not seeing colours, of everyone sort of being equal, but there was no gender fluidity.
Okay.
At all.
Just point blank.
Point blank.
No one spoke about it.
Didn't exist, and there was a big stigma and kind of difficulty with being gay because of AIDS. You know, and that was something that was on the mainstream media. I think I told you, like Eddie Murphy's Raw. It was like a massive section of that stand-up, and he was one of the mainstay comedians on Saturday Night Live, you know, with Dan Aykroyd and the Belushi brothers and so on.
But people weren't a fan at the time, as in, like, of that kind of material.
He was able to stand up and do this massive thing about gay people, and you know, he did this whole joke where he was like talking about he was being this big kind of like really hetero black guy,
right,
who went to the doctors because he wasn't feeling very well, and he was like, "You got AIDS?" And he was like, "What?" And that he caught AIDS off his wife because her friends were gay men.
Right.
You know, and that sort of joke, you know, to this predominantly black audience. So it was like, it was kind of mainstream and okay.
It was just enough.
To have this anti-gay sentiment, because everybody was terrified of getting AIDS. There was no cure, it was a killer. And so many people were, you know, public figures were clearly getting AIDS and dying. So it was, that was a difficult thing, and something that you would find very alien now.
What did you see happen when, like, the, not cure, but as in the medication for, like, to help people not die of AIDS, basically?
Well, that was a very slow process, and it was a process, but I think it was a process over a number of years, and I think it took quite a long time for the stigma of AIDS to sort of peter out. But for example, there was no trans culture other than the image of like a dirty old man dressing up as a woman,
right, yeah,
going around sex shops.
It was seen as a sexual thing rather than...
Yeah, absolutely. And so it was, there wasn't, and yet we had Boy George.
Right.
yet we have Boy George. So there were iconic figures.
There were plenty of like men dressing as women during that time.
And there were plenty of figures, like there was of men wearing makeup. I mean, all of the new romantic people and all of the people that were like punk, semi-punk. I mean, Robert Smith and The Cure, all of them, you know, wore lipstick and kind of had that pale look, the goth look. So it wasn't that it was a time where people were not open and accepting and people weren't able to be themselves, because they were.
Right.
But there wasn't the same thing as there is now of gender fluidity. And, you know, it's like your identity was determined by your gender in many ways.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Whereas, what's it called? Like, nowadays, it's very, like, well, not... You can basically do whatever. You might get, like, bullied or whatever, but it doesn't affect your life, really. But before... Can you talk a bit more about the history and, like, personal experiences that you've seen happen to other people? Like, whether it be celebrities or friends you knew.
In terms of...
Like, their experiences with, like, acceptance at the time.
Well, I suppose in the arts it was very different, and where we were in Earl's Court at Lambda it was very different. So, you know, I guess my experience was different to the culture at the time. The culture at the time, there was this group of people called yuppies.
Right.
Yeah, young, upwardly mobile, and that was any kind of culture.
Right.
So any culture, but there was a whole thing about, you know, making as much money as possible, living for the individual, and so the arts industry was very much a reaction against that kind of way of being.
Working for the art instead of the money.
Mm.
And therefore you had, like, different...
Yeah,
and everything.
it was a different ethics, different ethos. And a lot of, you know, Frankie Goes to Hollywood stuff is like anti-yuppie, anti that kind of person. You know, and a lot of the Britpop stuff that came out was kind of like, that came out of that 90s scene with Blur and Oasis, was sort of, again, a kind of observation of that world that didn't really care. And I think that Live Aid was a reaction against that as well. You know, and Bob Geldof and Midge Ure were very much put your hands in your pockets and help these people in Africa, and could see the absolute hypocrisy of the money-driven world in which we were living.
Makes sense. When Live Aid happened, were there changes, like, just in regular life, or were people more aware, or...?
I think people were more aware, yeah. I think it was a very... I think people felt very proud, and it was a very kind of triumphant thing, because it was so enormous.
Right.
And everybody just really got into the music. And for a lot of people, it was like their second sort of breath of life in a way. I mean, Queen hadn't performed for a while, you know. And even though Freddie Mercury knew that he was ill at that time, it kind of put them back on the map.
It was important to him.
Yeah, it was an important moment as far as that band was concerned. And I think it was an important moment for just anthem type stuff to happen, you know, and that for festivals and so on after that had a kind of different mega sort of vibe to them. And also were kind of politicised now.
Okay. Right. As opposed to before?
Well, but yeah, before, I don't think festivals were particularly politicised. But festivals have definitely become politicised now.
In what way do you think?
In that you can have a lot of elements of Extinction Rebellion, a lot of elements of green politics that are at the grassroots of a lot of the festival scenes.
How do you think?
Because a lot of the stuff that goes on around the tents, you know, if you go to Reading or you go to Glastonbury or any of those, there's a lot of stuff happening that is very kind of that ethos.
Well, Reading's got the clean-up crew thing where you can apply to clean up all the stuff now.
Yeah,
And
I mean,
it's
become very sustainable. It's become very environment aware.
Yeah.
You know, and so it's politicised.
Fair.
Whereas before, it was like a bit of a riot. Everybody got drunk. They left everything all over the place.
Right.
And
I mean, they still kind of do that.
they still kind of do, but it's become much more of a political statement in a way.
Right.
I don't mean with big P, I mean with a small P, but
Yeah.
it's kind of is. Festivals.
Do you think, like, the music and performances are? Or is that...
Yeah, I think that they are, and I think a lot of the stuff that the artists say in between their numbers are, you know. And I think it has become a voice, you know, it's become a voice of freedom and a voice of equality, and used as a platform. And I think before Live Aid, it wasn't really used in that way.
Right.
I mean, Bowie did.
Yeah,
Bowie did.
sure.
Bowie, at that point in time, was having interviews with MTV and saying, why are there no black artists on MTV?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? There were people that were politically vocal like that.
Bowie had a lot of, like, weird questions from interviewers about, like, what he was wearing or, like, his, like, sexual orientation. For, like, it wasn't relevant. The people on MTV just wanted, like, a story.
Yeah. And I think Bowie is an interesting point, as is Annie Lennox. You know, people who had a kind of non-gender stereotyped look.
Right.
That broke boundaries. Because, as I say, I definitely feel like, I mean, you know, what was number one at the time? Aswad, I think, were number one. You know, there was like the Aswad and Soul to Soul. The cultural boundaries were far less prevalent than perhaps they have been today, in actual fact.
How so?
A lot of the ethos of BLM goes against the ethos of Soul to Soul.
Right.
When you think about it.
As in...
Well, as in you have to identify someone's skin pigmentation as being black.
Right.
And the ethos of Soul to Soul is colour blindness, right? So you can't very well go around using that terminology if you're not actually going to be determining whether someone falls into a certain category or not.
Right.
Well, that was the whole point, is don't categorise people. People are just people.
Yeah.
You are who you are. It doesn't matter.
We're all one.
We're all one, exactly. That was the whole idea. Universal love. That was the whole idea. And that ethos has been lost somewhat. For whatever reason, people can always come up with any amount of justification, but at the end of the day, I think that that it's kind of done a bit of a shift in terms of scales. You know, that gender fluidity and gender identity has become much more accepted.
Right.
But the whole idea of like cultural appropriation, well, that means you've got to identify someone as being from a certain culture to begin with. Completely goes against A, the Race Relations Act, and B, the ethos that we kind of grew up with in the 90s of colour blindness.
So you think that the trans issues and race issues have done like basically a swap?
And indeed, that's how it seems to me.
How... The way that you describe it, I don't know, I've never heard someone like talk about that kind of thing before. Like, it's quite interesting how... Because the way you talk about it, they're almost the same, do you know what I mean? Whereas most people take them as separate issues nowadays. Do you know what I mean?
How do you mean?
As in, if I was to ask, like, anyone a question about race or about, like, gender politics and, like, LGBT stuff, they usually wouldn't correlate the two. Whereas they do go together quite well, like, in your argument.
It's basically, it boils down to this, right? It's all to do with an individual's right to their own identity.
Yeah.
And ultimately, in today's culture, they would seriously sit there and say, it's absolutely fine for me to identify as a woman.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
But my great-great-grandparents were black slaves on the island of Mauritius, right? So when you look at me, I have more black in me than I do female.
Right.
But I don't look like a black person. My cousin does, but I don't in particular, right? So people would get very offended if I said I'm black or I'm a person of colour. But they wouldn't be offended at all if I said I identify as a woman and my name is Maureen. I'm saying I should be able to say I identify as a woman of colour.
Fair enough.
And
So
my name is Maureen, because you can't say you're allowed to identify as whatever you want
pick and choose.
with your sexual orientation, but I'm now going to determine whether you can say you're black or not. And who is the person who's making that judgment? Who cast this person as the commissar of culture? And what formula are they using to determine whether someone is indeed black enough or not? Remember, we live on an island where there isn't one Pict or Engle amongst us. We're all sons and daughters of immigrants or invaders, right?
Yeah.
We are all mixed blood, mixed culture, mixed identity.
In the past, I have been told that I'm too white to identify as Korean, which was crazy.
Which is mental, right? So if you could choose, if you were able to choose your own gender identity, it seems lunacy to me to then say, and who is this person who's saying this to you? What formula are they using? And the difficulty is, the profound difficulty is, that you really don't have to look back very far into history to find where the formula was written down. And it was written down in Mein Kampf by the Nazis.
Right.
Because it's the identical formula. Because if you're identifying who is Aryan and who isn't, you can apply exactly the same formula to saying who's black and who isn't. Because someone at some point has got to turn around to me and say, you're not black enough to call yourself black. So what is the formula that they're using, number one? And number two, who are they to say that? Who gave them the right to say that? So the ethos of the 90s was, no one's got the right to say that. Everyone is equal. No one's got the right to make an assumption about somebody's cultural history or heritage. It is irrelevant and it's racist.
Right.
And anyone who says anything about anybody's cultural background, about their skin pigmentation, is automatically an infringement of the Race Relations Act and was deemed to be a racist, right? That's it, full stop.
But it's changed quite a lot.
It's changed a lot, but the difficulty for me is I just hear this racist language. It doesn't matter whether it's coming out of the mouth of a Ku Klux Klan member or whether it's coming out of the mouth of a Black Panther member. It's still racism. whichever way you look at it. And Morgan Freeman has said the same thing.
That what?
That he has not experienced what the ethos behind BLM is talking about. He doesn't see it, he doesn't recognise it, he doesn't acknowledge it, and that people are people.
He would rather just everyone.
Because you look at the age that he is.
Yeah.
You know, he's been through the same experience. And I think what happens is that people with different agendas
Right.
piggyback onto something unfortunate that happens, and then use that as their own political manifesto to kind of further their own ends. Because at the end of the day, you know, any form of oppression comes out of a situation where people feel they're justified in engaging in that oppressive behaviour.
Right.
So they feel like they are victims.
How do you think that change happened?
I just think that the nature of having human beings being in conflict with other human beings means that you have to have, in some way, you've got to have somehow sides. You've got to have black chess pieces and white chess pieces. You have to have tribalism of some description in order for people to have that way of thinking, in order to use that way of thinking to form armies to go and fight against each other. So if they haven't got that way of thinking in terms of gender, then they'll make people think that way in terms of culture. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
There always seems to have to be some form of tribalism going on in society. And I think, my experience is that it is to control people.
So if we have to, like, in your words, like, have to have some sort of tribalism, then how do you think that the, like, gender, sexuality, like, thing has done the exact opposite of it? And we've become...
Well, it has. It's done the opposite of that, but what happens is, I think it's the same elite group of people that have always been in control and in charge and manipulate the masses with mass and manipulate the media and manipulate the propaganda that's put out in the media. They'll let one thing go there, but then they focus on something else.
Right. Do you think that the attitude towards, like, sexuality and gender issues will do another flip at some point?
No, I don't. I don't think that will. I think that... Oh, it might. Who knows? You know, it only takes a couple of things, doesn't it? For then the wind to suddenly shift and change.
I doubt that my generation would let that happen.
Yeah, you say that. I doubt that my generation would let happen what has happened with the cultural side of things.
Right.
But we have, and I'm the one who's accused of being, you know... What am I accused of being?
Insensitive?
Yeah, insensitive, or, you know, not acknowledging cultural background, which is absolute bollocks. That's the opposite of what I'm saying.
It's the way you grew up with.
Yeah, it's what you grew up with. And what we grew up with was absolute colour blindness, cultural blindness, right? Respect,
yep.
But total, it was neither here nor there. In exactly the same way that you're experiencing that now with gender, okay? But with gender, it was the equivalent to what you experienced with culture, yeah?
Right. Like, it was acknowledged and whatever, but people were more in, like...
Yeah, and it was a really sexist time. There was, you know, films, mainstream films, comedy films. I mean, if you watch Trading Places,
yeah.
And, you know, they're all kind of like... sexualising women in that sort of very overt kind of way and making gags out of it.
Yeah.
And people played into it because that was the time in which we were living.
Like, what's it called? Not necessarily, like a misogynistic standpoint, but at the end of Ace Ventura, there's a gag, and in Soap Dish actually, there's a gag that someone is seen to be trans, and then, like, people throw up at the thought.
Yeah.
So... yeah, it's definitely changed in our media as well.
Exactly. And, I mean, look how much stuff we had to change in Sister Act.
Yeah. Yeah.
You
There's a
know,
lot of
how
jokes.
much stuff was in there that was, like, so inappropriate for now. And it was all
Yeah.
to do with, like, attitudes to trans, attitudes to
Race, yeah.
race.
Did
So-
we change that much about gender issues? I think there was only a couple lines about, like, the drag queen, but...
There were some lines about the drag queen. Yeah, maybe it was just that.
I don't think we changed those either. Maybe that's, what's it called? Telling of the attitudes towards them doing different things.
Maybe. Yeah.
Thank you for doing this for me.
Most a pleasure. But as I say, that's my view, but that was, you know, the view of someone